You're listening to a series on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Most of the information in this series is drawn from Dr. Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. You can find links to other episodes in this series, as well as his fantastic book, in the description. Who was President Harry Truman? A president? A hero? A war criminal? A father? How do we learn about him? Well, from his biographers, but which biography depicts him most accurately? One written immediately after his presidency? What about a biography written 50 years after his death? You're sacrificing proximity to the man, but you've seen the legacy of his actions from the establishment of the United Nations to the aftermath of the atom bomb. On that note, if you had his chief of staff, a rural American, his wife, and a survivor of the atom bomb each write biographies about this man, you might end up with 4 very different stories. This is an analogy that a theology professor of mine used to describe the 4 gospel writers. But unlike Truman's sources, we're dealing with authors who wrote thousands of years ago, and historians today are likewise quite removed from the sources they dealt with. So who was Jesus Christ? A wise man? A prophet? The Son of God? A failed revolutionary? A hippie? Answering this question is crucial to Christians because it informs us how we ought to live our lives. Some of you may recall from my Ecumenical Councils series that the church spent hundreds of years discussing, deliberating, and murdering each other over the identity of Jesus. There's a big difference between Jesus being some wise guy and him being the incarnate Son of God. Even within his divinity, if you believe in that, there are huge differences between, as I just implied, a hippie Messiah and a political revolutionary one. This is one reason why historical Jesus studies are so important. To know Jesus means to know his character as well as the time period he lived in. At the heart of the question of Jesus' character is the nature of his death. Namely, if Jesus died but never resurrected, thousands of years of tradition and theology would be destabilized if not destroyed. There are dozens of theories about what happened from the Friday Jesus died to the Sunday he allegedly rose, from traditional interpretations of a resurrection to hallucinations to a doppelganger Jesus walking around doing his thing. For years, I, as a Catholic, have searched for a comprehensive synthesis of studies about the resurrection, and I feel confident in saying that I've found one. This is Dr. Dale Allison's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. Dr. Allison, in my opinion, gives an excellent overview of the data we have to work with, as well as a thorough examination of the most prominent theories about what happened during these 3 crucial days in human history. Dr. Allison writes like a detective, laying out the evidence we have and examining various theories about the resurrection narrative before he lays out his own conclusions. In this series, we will briefly delve into some of the main themes of his book. But before we do, I want to dedicate a little time explaining a little more why a Catholic channel like mine is so interested in historical Jesus studies. I've already mentioned that to be a good Christian is to emulate Jesus. To emulate Jesus is to know Jesus, and to know Jesus is to know his worldview. Though in the Catholic tradition we must go beyond even this. Rather than ask what did the historical Jesus say or do or think of himself, we must ask what the Church witnessed in its earliest years between the historical Jesus, apparitions, and creative inspiration from the Holy Spirit. That brings me to my second point. I want to hammer home that the Gospel writers were not historians in the modern sense of the term. As I'll detail in the next couple episodes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not cross-examining witnesses for the sake of writing a definitive life of Christ. The evangelists, rather, were theologians seeking to spread the good news of Jesus. In this series, we'll often highlight some inconsistencies and even contradictions in the Gospels to show that history often took a backseat to theology, meaning the evangelists often either didn't care about the minute details or invented some of their own to fit their theological agendas and craft a coherent story. A wise theology professor of mine once said that if God wanted the Gospels to be historically accurate accounts of Jesus' life in a literal sense, God would have given us 1, not 4 books. This is why I can say that theology comes first. The agendas of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are different, albeit in the Catholic tradition we believe that they are inspired by the Holy Spirit. I heard Tommy fell and broke his arm. Turns into I hear Will pushed Tommy to the ground and broke his arm, fairly easily, thanks to a few rumors and a little creative animosity against this Will guy. Tommy fell while he was running and balancing a pizza might arise from some additional rumors that desire to make Will look a little better. All three sources really do believe they have the correct story, though. My third point is that the author of this book is not Catholic. Shocker. He was highly recommended to me by some of my Catholic professors, and his work is widely acclaimed by biblical scholars of many backgrounds, from Protestantism to Catholicism to atheism. My point here is that Catholics can and should be engaging with good work being done by other denominations and even other faiths. For background, Dr. Allison is a church-attending Presbyterian. His favorite author is Aldous Huxley. His favorite theologians are Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Isaac of Nineveh, and Gregory Palamas. He also enjoys Blaise Pascal and William James, the philosophers. I've read many historical Jesus studies, Catholic and non-Catholic, and Dr. Allison's work is by far my favorite. My fourth point is to, on one hand, address common attacks against the historicity of Jesus' death and resurrection. On the other hand, we should also be humbled by how little we can actually prove about the details of the resurrection. This leads to my fifth and final point. I've noticed immense skepticism from Catholics, mostly conservative ones, about historical Jesus studies. A lot of my peers think that historical Jesus studies are inherently anti-Catholic. My goal is to show that this is far from the case. But before we do that, I think it's a good idea to explore why Catholics are so skeptical of historical Jesus studies. And that's exactly what we'll do next episode. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.